Assalamu alaikum. So today we want to talk about whether or not the previous scriptures were really corrupted. So, first of all, when we talk about the English word corrupted, so sometimes people say the previous scriptures were corrupted, sometimes they say they were distorted. So, when we talk about this, we have to define really carefully what word we want to use because corrupt and distort have different meanings. So when we refer to a text or even like a computer file and we say that it's corrupted, we mean that there have been alterations done to it that make it unusable. So a text or a computer file is unusable. But if we say distorted, something is distorted, then what we mean is something about the meaning of it or something like that has been twisted. Another point is that we want to go to the exact wording of the Qur'an. And how does the Qur'an describe what happened with the previous scriptures? And the word that we want to look at in the Qur'an is the word tahreef, which I would more closely translate as distortion. So let's look at the verses of the Qur'an to see if they support the idea that the previous scriptures were distorted, or what should be our view of the previous scriptures. Because this is kind of one of those cookie cutter topics that when we become Muslim, we're taught that this is how we have to think about it. This is the correct way to think about it. And there isn't an alternative way to think about it, or at least there isn't an alternative way that is usually presented in the popular discourse. So we want to look at the verses of the Quran and see, does the Quran actually give us a different way to think about that? So chapter 4, verse 46 is where we're going to start. So chapter 4, verse 46 says, من الذين هادوا يحرفون الكلمة عن مواضعه. From those who were Jewish, يحرفون, they do tahrif of the words from their places. So the first observation I want to make is that tahrif here is connected with distorting the words from their places. So notice he doesn't just talk about distorting the words themselves, he talks about distorting them from their places. Okay, so that could start us off with an idea or a clue about what tahrif of the previous scriptures could mean. It doesn't necessarily have to mean that the words themselves were distorted, but it could just mean that they were taken out of context, they were interpreted in different ways. It could refer to the way that they were understood, but we're going to talk about it more as we go. I just wanted to point that out because in the next two verses that we're going to read, we're going to find a similar phrase. And then he continues, يحرفون الكلمة عن مواضعه ويقولون سمعنا وعصينا. And they say, we have listened and we have disobeyed. واسمع غير مسمع, and listen غير مسمع. وراعنا, and they say راعنا ليا بألسنتهم. This is the point of the verse I wanted to get to, that they say this ليا بألسنتهم, by twisting their tongues. So here in the first verse that we're reading, tahrif is connected with, number one, removing words from their places, and number two, with twisting the tongues. So that potentially gives us some explanation of what happened with the previous scriptures. It's not necessarily that they're unusable or we can't find the truth in them, but they've been taken, the words have been taken out of their proper context, and some of the meanings may have been twisted. So twisting with the tongue is supporting the idea of distortion. The meanings have been distorted, but we're going to talk more about that as we go. The next verse that we're going to look at is chapter 5, verse 13. So chapter 5, verse 13, in the middle of the verse, he says, يُحَرِّفُونَ الْكَلِمَ عَنْ مَوَاضِعِهِ. He says, they distort, again, similar wording, they distort the words from their places. Okay, so we have that idea of distorting the words from their places again. And that's verse 13 in chapter 5. Now, if we skip 14, we go to 15, and let's listen to what verse 15 says. In verse 15, he says, يَا أَهْلَ الْكِتَابِ قَدْ جَاءَكُمْ رَسُولُنَا يُبَيِّنُ لَكُمْ كَثِيرًا مِمَّا كُنْتُمْ تُخْفُونَ مِنَ الْكِتَابِ. He says, O people of the book, there has come to you our messenger, explaining and clarifying to you much of what you used to hide from the book. So you see, two verses later, right, after he says in verse 13, يُحَرِّفُونَ الْكَلِمَ عَنْ مَوَاضِعِهِ, that they distort the words from their places. In verse 15, a couple verses later, he says, كَثِيرًا مِمَّا كُنْتُمْ تُخْفُونَ مِنَ الْكِتَابِ, much of what you used to hide from the book. So, from the verse that we read previously, twisting or distorting the meanings could be one aspect of tahreef, and the other aspect here could be hiding certain meanings or certain words. And then if we go to verse 41, so verse 41 in this same surah, in the middle of the verse he says, يُحَرِّفُونَ الْكَلِمَ مِنْ بَعْدِ مَوَاضِعِهِ. He says they distort the words min ba'di mawadi'ihi, from after. Literally, the literal translation is from after their places. So after their places. So in the previous verses he said an mawadi'ihi, from their places. Here he says min ba'di mawadi'ihi, from after. Now I want to come back to that wording, inshallah, in a minute. We're going to put that on hold for 1 second though. For right now, I just want you to pay attention to, again, this is the third verse that uses tahrif, yuharrifun, distortion, and connects it with the idea of being from their places or after their places, something about places. But I want to read a little bit further. So this is 541. So if we go to 543, which is just a couple verses later, he says, وَكَيْفَ يُحَكِّمُونَكَ وَعِنْدَهُمُ التَّوْرَاةُ فِيهَا حُكْمُ اللَّهِ ثُمَّ يَتَوَلَّوْنَ مِنْ بَعْدِ ذَلِكَ وَمَا أُولَٰئِكَ بِالْمُؤْمِنِينَ. He says, and how do they make you a judge? While with them is at-Tawrah, is the Torah. فِيهَا حُكْمُ اللَّهِ, in which is the judgment of Allah. So 2 verses after, he said they distort the words min ba'di mawadi'ihi, after their places. 2 verses later he says, how do they make you a judge when they have the Torah, in which is the judgment of Allah? Now why would he say that if you couldn't find the judgment of Allah within it? Follow my point? This is right after he said they distorted it. So Allah knows best, but I would argue from these verses that, number one, the tahrif is not necessarily saying these previous scriptures are unusable or we can't find the teachings of Allah within the previous scriptures, but they twisted some of the meanings, they hid some of the meanings. But he mentions that in the Torah, for example, is hukmullah. We can still find the judgment of Allah, and it has to do with mawadi'ihi, going away from the place or taking certain things out of context. So now we're going to go to the last verse that uses the word tahrif, which is verse 75 of chapter 2. So 275. So 275 is very interesting. So 275 says, أَفَتَطْمَعُونَ أَنْ يُؤْمِنُوا لَكُمْ, would you hope that they would believe you? وَقَدْ كَانَ فَرِيقٌ مِّنْهُمْ, while a group from amongst them used to يَسْمَعُونَ كَلَامَ اللَّهِ, used to listen to the speech of Allah, ثُمَّ يُحَرِّفُونَهُ, then they would distort it, مِن بَعْدِ مَا عَقَلُوهُ وَهُمْ يَعْلَمُونَ. Min ba'di, remember I said we're going to come back to that word? Min ba'di ma aqaluhu, after they understood it, wahum ya'lamun, while they had knowledge. They distorted it after having understood it while having knowledge. Min ba'di ma aqaluhu, after they understood it while having knowledge. Now, what's interesting to me about that is that yuharrifunahu, right, or yuharrifun al-kalim, the tahrif of the kalim, the tahrif of the words, the distortion of the words, in the previous 3 verses was always connected with mawadi'ihi, with their places, meaning in their context. But here is the only verse that uses the word tahrif, but doesn't connect it specifically with the word mawadi'ihi, with the places. But it says min ba'di ma aqaluhu, after they understood it. Now look at the similarity. In 541 he says, يُحَرِّفُونَ الْكَلِمَ مِنْ بَعْدِ مَوَاضِعِهِ, they distort the words after their mawadi'ihi, after their places, right? Here, يُحَرِّفُونَهُ مِنْ بَعْدِ مَا عَقَلُوهُ, they distort it after they understood it. So putting those verses together, I would say because the previous three verses were all connected to mawadi'ihi, their places, and specifically the last one that we read was min ba'di mawadi'ihi, from after their places, and this one is min ba'di ma aqaluhu, that their places means their understanding, right? So how do you put something in its proper place? A word in its proper place is the understanding of it, and when you remove it from its proper place, you remove the proper understanding from it. So what the Qur'an does is the Qur'an gives us the ability to put the words in their proper places. So these verses don't necessarily mean, Allah knows best, in my humble estimation, that we can't look at the previous scriptures and find truth in them and find the judgment of Allah and find the teachings of Allah. But we can also find other things too. And that's perhaps also where some of the distortion comes. Because if we look in another verse, which is a couple verses later here, so chapter 2 again, verse 79, he says, فَوَيْلٌ لِلَّذِينَ يَكْتُبُونَ الْكِتَابَ بِأَيْدِيهِمْ. So woe to those who write the book with their own hands. ثُمَّ يَقُولُونَ هَذَا مِنْ عِنْدِ اللَّهِ. And then they say this is from Allah, right? And in another verse, in chapter 3, verse 78, chapter 3, verse 78, he says, وَإِنَّ مِنْهُمْ لَفَرِيقًا يَلْوُونَ أَلْسِنَتَهُمْ بِالْكِتَابِ لِتَحْسَبُوهُ مِنَ الْكِتَابِ وَمَا هُوَ مِنَ الْكِتَابِ وَيَقُولُونَ هُوَ مِنْ عِنْدِ اللَّهِ وَمَا هُوَ مِنْ عِنْدِ اللَّهِ. And from amongst them is a group who twist their tongues with the book, so that you would think it is from the book, but it is not from the book. And they say it is from Allah, but it is not from Allah. So when you put these two verses together, he talks about some people who write the book with their own hands and others who twist their tongues with the book. So they're trying to add things within it or take the things that are within it and twist it in order to make you think that it's from Allah. So that's another potential place that the distortion comes from, is by other things being added with the book that don't originally belong to it. That doesn't mean that the words themselves that are in the book are lost or distorted necessarily. It just means that, number one, they've either been hidden, or they've been taken out of context, or the understanding of them has been distorted, or things have been added to the book that takes away from the meaning. And this brings us to the root word for yuharrifun, to distort. It comes from or is related to the word harf. Harf in Arabic means tarafu shay. It means the edge of something. So for example, in Surah 22:11, he says, وَمِنَ النَّاسِ مَنْ يَعْبُدُ اللَّهَ عَلَى حَرْفٍ. And from amongst people are those who worship Allah upon a harf, upon an edge, right? Because فَإِنَّ أَصَابَهُ خَيْرٌ اطْمَأَنَّ بِهِ. Because if good befalls that person, they're tranquil with it. وَإِنْ أَصَابَتْهُ فِتْنَةٌ انْقَلَبَ عَلَى وَجْهِهِ. I believe the verse says. Let's look at the verse to make sure that I'm giving you the right quote here. So 22:11, he says, وَمِنَ النَّاسِ مَنْ يَعْبُدُ اللَّهَ عَلَى حَرْفٍ فَإِنْ أَصَابَهُ خَيْرٌ اطْمَأَنَّ بِهِ وَإِنْ أَصَابَتْهُ فِتْنَةٌ انْقَلَبَ عَلَى وَجْهِهِ. Right? And from amongst people are those who worship Allah upon an edge. And if good hits them, they are tranquil with it. And if a fitna, some trial befalls them, انْقَلَبَ عَلَى وَجْهِهِ, he turns upon his wajh. So he's on an edge. Depending on what happens, he goes this way or that way. So that's from the root meaning of harf. Tahrif is an edge. So how does that relate to يُحَرِّفُونَ الْكَلِمَ عَنْ مَوَاضِعِهِ? They do tahrif of the words from their places. How I think that could relate is what happens in tahrif sometimes is that you go to the edge of the meaning. So meaning, we find things in the Bible, and Allah knows best exactly if Jesus said it or not. I'm just giving examples. Let's say if Jesus referred to himself as, or referred to God, as the Father, right? Potentially in that time and in that language, that had metaphorical meanings, not meaning literally a biological father, but a person can take that and go to the edge of the meaning, take it completely out of context, and not apply the central meaning that fits in the context that it was said. So each word or each expression has a central meaning that fits in the context in which it is said. But a person can go to the harf of the meaning. They can go all the way to the edge of the meaning, where technically the word can carry that meaning, but we can see from the context that that's not what it means. So to call Jesus the only begotten Son, for example, that's the edge of the meaning. Because what does begotten even mean? Does it mean that God like had sex with someone and gave birth to Jesus? No, I mean, we wouldn't say that, right? So they're going to the edge of the meaning. Whereas when we use the Quran can help us come back to the actual meaning of what was said in the previous scriptures. So perhaps based on that, we can say the previous scriptures were not corrupted in the sense of they're unusable and we can't find truth and we can't find Allah's teaching in them, but they had tahreef done to them, which could occur in many different ways, including going to the edge of the meaning of the words, taking the words from their places out of context, adding things which makes the overall message confusing, and hiding things. And Allah knows best. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.